All right, so now we're back for the second part. Starting off with point number 4, there were exclusive powers the states retained for themselves. First and foremost was their ability to control domestic and foreign trade. Trade was something that England had tried to control, especially our trade with France, because France was always an enemy of England. And obviously, if we're told that you can't sell to someone who that's affecting your ability to make money, colonists resented that, and they definitely did not want to hand over that power to the federal government. So they decided that no, a federal government could not have the power to control what they could and could not do with their trade. They could take action in family affairs, economic matters, debts, and contracts. So all legal matters. The action in family affairs would have been like marriage certificates, death certificates, birth certificates. Economic matters and debts would have been, bankruptcy, contracts, land sales, and so on. All of that was maintained by the colonies and not allowed to be touched by the federal government. And the most important part is they could tax their citizens. They've been taxing them since the inception of the colonies, because they had to be able to pay their colonial debts. However, even with the war, there's going to be a lot of debt that the colonies are going to try to pass off to the federal government, and it's going to cause some problems. Number 5, laws could be passed with a 9 to 13 vote. So basically, laws, when they decided to write a bill and pass a law, 9 of the 13 states, or 2/3, would have to agree to that law. All 13 states would have to agree to make changes to the articles, which is kind of what we have today. Any amendments to the Constitution cannot be made with only with a majority vote. There has to be a unanimous vote for amendments. That's the reason why in the Constitution there have only been 27 amendments to the Constitution in the 200 years that we've had that document. Number 7, all states would cooperate in the following areas. They would recognize civil acts like marriage, birth, wills, and death certificates that were issued by another state. So couples that got married in New Jersey would still be recognized as married in Virginia. And they also agreed that they would return any runaway criminals or slaves. Nobody would be able to find sanctuary in another state. They also agreed that if there was an interstate dispute, so Maryland is mad at Virginia because the Potomac River flooded and damaged land or something like that, it would be settled through arbitration. They would not go to court. Capital letter C, the lasting achievements of the Articles of Confederation. Number 1, the Confederation lasted for 8 years, and that's a pretty lengthy amount of time for a system of government that was, very weak. The fact that we were not attacked, that our country was not put through any major tests to test this confederation is directly an act of God. Because it would be during this 8 years of confederation that any of the European powers looking to reclaim their lands in North America could have done it. Even England. If England had decided that now they wanted the colonies back, they could have come full force, and we probably would not have been able to survive. But God really protected us while we were figuring out what kind of government we should have. Number 2, the most important legislation dealt with the expansion to the Western territories. Going back to what the English tried to do after the French and Indian War, they realized that there was too much land to be policed, and they told the colonists they could not expand to the west. Well, colonists happily ignored them and continued to move to the west. So now that we have this northwest land, they had to decide how was the best way to go about it to sell it. And the Northwest Territory, little letter 1, was the land from the colonies on the east to the Ohio River on the south, the Mississippi River to the west, and the Great Lakes to the north. And this was land that we had received as part of our agreement to the Treaty of Paris. And so this piece of legislation right here, the Northwest Ordinance of 1785, provided for the sale and survey of the land. So number 2, the Northwest Ordinance of 1785 provided for the survey and sale of the Northwest land. They divided each of the land into townships, which were about 6 miles. They were 6-mile tracts. You have to remember, I know that right now in our modern day, going 6 miles is nothing. But back then, 6 miles was considered a day's ride. And especially with farms growing up around a township, it would be the center of commerce. And so these tracts of land, they were about 6 miles. They were called townships. And then inside of that 6 miles, they divided the land further down into 640 acres. The original intent of this ordinance was so that private citizens who wanted to better their circumstances would have the ability to buy large pieces of land for very, very cheap. They had hoped that this would encourage families to move west and establish the Western Territory. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. What ended up happening is, yes, some people did take advantage of this very generous offer. It was 640 acres, and it was sold at $1 an acre. And there were those private citizens who were able to do that. But most people, just coming out of the war, they were not in that position. They did not have $640 laying around. And even if they had extended family, $640 was a pretty considerable amount. So what ended up happening was you had large companies coming together and buying up this land so that they could then cut it down to smaller tracts of land and sell that at a higher cost. Before I get ahead of myself, let me point out parenthesis. One section of the township was to be dedicated to schools, and I already mentioned to you that the land was to be sold at $1 per acre. Little letter A, Congress had to buy the legal rights to sell the land from the Indians. So even though Great Britain had given us this land, finally we were recognizing that, not to say that prior to this time, you did have people who did deal lawfully with the Indians, but then you also had people who dealt unlawfully with the Indians. The interesting thing, Howard, here to realize is that people deal lawfully and unlawfully with each other all the time. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about 1776 or 2021. The problem is that man is innately sinful and we're selfish, and we will always look out for number one before we look out for the other. And that's why God told us to love our neighbor as ourselves. So underneath the ordinance, the Congress, the government said, you have to buy the rights so that you have the rights to sell the land. So that was a big step in the right direction. We're not, for every right step we take in a particular direction, Howard, you'll realize that we take a couple steps back sometimes. And you're going to see that as we get further into American history. Little letter B, I told you that one of the downsides to selling the land for $1 an acre was that for all the land that was not bought, big land companies like the Ohio Company went in and bought up all the land that was not privately owned. This laid the foundation for how little letter 6, this ordinance laid the foundation for how we would establish future land acquisitions, because after this we're going to have the Louisiana Purchase. We're going to send Lewis and Clark on their expeditions, and we are going to continue to gain land for the next 75 years or thereabouts. We're not going until we get to the war with Texas, or over Texas, and go all the way out to the and we're going to start fighting Mexico for the land rights to Texas and to California, and then we will finally reach what the land that goes from sea to shining sea. So, but this was very important, this piece of legislation, because for all the land that will come into the Union after this, it will set a precedent for how we handle it. 2 years later, we have the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and this now provides for how a territory was to be governed, and it allowed for the Confederation to appoint a governor of the territories, to set up judges and courts, and to even have a secretary. And it went, remember that the first ordinance broke up the land into townships, which are small units. Now it's breaking the territory into territories that would eventually become states. Underneath the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, you have that once a territory reached the population of 5,000 free white men, the territory could elect a legislature. So, territory had to have 5,000 free white men, and then it could elect a legislature. Once it reached 60,000 free white men, it could apply for statehood. Out of this ordinance, it created 5 new states. And underneath this ordinance, it allowed for religious freedom, and here's the most important part, it forbade slavery. So under this ordinance, the act of slavery could not grow further west. And this will become a point of contention, because for all the land we add, Congress is going to work very hard, especially those from northern states, to keep the power, to keep the influence of slavery very, very limited. The other achievements of the Articles of Confederation, it was under them that we have the congressional record. So they started keeping a diary of all the entries of congressional hearings, and we still do that today. So the Articles of Confederation initiated the keeping of the congressional record. And the second achievement, outside of what we've already discussed, is that it established the decimal system for coining money. Now, I'm going to stop the video here. We're going to pick up with Roman numeral number 2. We're very close. I'm going to be giving you your homework assignment soon.